What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
Survival horror is a genre that encompasses some of the most important and influential projects in gaming, including early Resident Evil and Silent Hill titles, Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower, and more, not only because of their tried and true formula of exploration-based gameplay and palpably frightening atmosphere, but in some cases also because of extremely investing, subtle storytelling, cleverly subversive writing, and ingenious utilization of thematic elements. It's a genre that is simultaneously popular because of these timeless gems, and also niche in its enthusiast potential, sort of like horror films. Regardless of an individual project's popularity, there's a lot of great finds waiting to be experienced, and that's just as true for games. The world of horror is an immense landscape that includes a sea of subgenres, and there's always at least one for anybody to enjoy. But in the video game industry, it's survival horror specifically that has made what is quite possibly the biggest splash, with its rich history that stretches from its humble beginnings several decades ago to its more recent market dominance with all the classics that came out in between. The journey from point A to point B, however, was not without its tribulations, including a noticeable shift away from its horror-focused origins and toward the realm of action, which led to a period of confused identity that can still be felt today. With no clear-cut definition of the term, particularly in regards to gameplay mechanics, some people are left to wonder, what exactly is survival horror? In this video, I'll be touching on two core topics of the conversation. A brief history of the survival horror subgenre, including its pioneering titles, rise in popularity, subsequent transition to action-dominant gameplay, and aftermath. Then I'll be going over what I personally believe what makes a game survival horror, not just thematically but interactively. The discussion of what gameplay elements makes a game survival horror as opposed to action horror is a bit of a hot-button topic among genre enthusiasts, and I have my own thoughts on the matter. Of course, I wouldn't dare suggest that I'm some sort of authority on the subject. There's absolutely other players and content creators out there who dedicate themselves to these games with more passion than me. I'm just a guy who enjoys both survival and action horror games on occasion, and I'm interested in just offering my own perspective. So, without any further ado, let's begin. Survival horror has roots that date back as far as 1981 to a little game called AX2, Uchu Yusosen Nostromo, or Space Freighter Nostromo, developed by Akira Takiguchi for the Commodore PET 2001 series of home computers. It was later ported to the NEC PC 6000 series of home computers by Hiromi Oba. It was a fairly simple game, where the player must escape a spaceship by utilizing a very limited set of resources to find an exit, all while avoiding the wrath of an unkillable monster constantly patrolling the corridors. It's possible to lock yourself into an unwinnable situation, and the only way to progress is to let the monster kill you and start over. As you can likely assume based on the premise of the game and the title, it was heavily influenced by the classic sci-fi horror film Alien. As you can see, it's definitely a product of its time, but this is what a horror game was back in the early 80s, and avoiding that alien, represented by a roaming @ symbol, could be fairly stressful. However, the game that is often credited with inventing the survival horror formula as we currently see it is Sweet Home. Developed by Capcom under the direction of Tokuro Fujiwara, and released in 1989 for the Famicom. It's a turn-based role-playing game that is also, coincidentally, based on a movie, but this time as an official adaptation. Matter of fact, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, the movie's director, and Juzo Itami, one of its producers, acted as the game's supervisor and producer respectively. The Sweet Home game featured 5 playable characters who can roam around a haunted mansion solo or in teams of 2 or 3. Each character has a special item that is required to solve puzzles scattered throughout the house, and the player must adequately manage their inventory to ensure that they have the correct tools at the correct time. Regardless, lots of backtracking will happen as the mansion adopts a Metroidvania-style structure, where areas open up with keys and items acquired later. The only way to heal is finding tonics around the map, and much of the story is told through notes and diary entries. Encounters with enemies occurred randomly, but it wasn't always necessary to fight. You had to pick and choose your battles to ensure survival, because if a character dies, they're gone for good. A lot of this gameplay probably sounds familiar, and it should, because most of it would be brought over to what was originally intended to be Sweet Home's remake, Resident Evil.
Wow, what a mansion!
Released in 1996 on the PlayStation 1, Resident Evil was produced by Sweet Home's director, Tokuro Fujiwara, and directed by his pupil, Shinji Mikami. The amount of mechanics and details it adopted from its source of inspiration was massive. The mansion setting, puzzles, inventory management, storytelling through notes, picking and choosing which enemies to fight and which to run from, a Metroidvania-like map with lots of backtracking, multiple endings based on how many characters survive, and much, much more. The big difference, however, was combat. Resident Evil obviously did not end up being a turn-based RPG. In its prototype phase, it was actually going to be a first-person shooter. But according to Mikami himself, another horror game, Alone in the Dark, convinced him to instead adopt a static third-person camera, which allowed the Capcom team to create detailed, pre-rendered backgrounds that could be utilized in place of low-resolution and primitive-looking 3D environmental models, which, in turn, obviously also meant the implementation of tank controls. The game soon launched and history was made. The survival horror genre was further thrust into the mainstream, commanded by this jaw-dropping new experience that combined head-scratching puzzles, terrifying enemies, and a tangible, harrowing atmosphere. But the growth of the survival horror realm didn't stop there. Just shy of 2 years later, in 1998, the equally if not better regarded sequel, Resident Evil 2, launched to great fanfare. And only a year after that, Konami graced the gaming world with Silent Hill, which leaned significantly more towards psychological horror themes as opposed to standard zombie apocalypse or haunted house fare, for which the series quickly became renowned in its subtle, layered implementation. It truly drove the point home that survival horror video games could be just as much about complex narratives, characters, and morality as they were about scares. Together, these two franchises would go on to lead the young and once niche genre to bigger and greater heights, with assistance from other titles like Clock Tower, Dino Crisis, Fatal Frame, Haunting Ground, and Siren. But somewhere along the road, something went a little sideways. At some point near the end of the survival horror golden age, most of the aforementioned franchises decided to take a turn for the flashier. Level design was becoming less open and Metroidvania-like and more linear. Combat was less optional and clunky, and more mandatory and finer tuned. Puzzles were becoming easier or outright removed. Cutscenes became more frenetic and started to include bombastic set pieces. Basically, game developers were deciding to broaden the appeal of their properties by leaning away from traditional horror elements and themes of helplessness and investigative progression, and towards more bullets, explosions, and visceral confrontation. It was no longer about wisely picking your battles, scouring the map for keys, solving puzzles, and carefully managing your resources, but about precise aim with your machine gun and fast reflexes for quick-time events. The line separating survival horror from action horror became blurred and at a breakneck speed. Resident Evil 4, released in January 2005, is often singled out as the cause of this drastic change. It was the first big project belonging to what used to be a more traditional survival horror IP to dive face first into action horror territory, much to the satisfaction of a lot of Resident Evil fans, but also the chagrin of genre purists. It was a smash hit, with many reviewers praising Capcom's decision to improve the combat and abandon the static camera, and the game still managed to latch on to some of its horror roots while doing so. It not only ended up being widely considered as one of the best Resident Evil games, but also one of the best games of that generation and one of the best games of all time. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Resident Evil 4 was to Capcom as Final Fantasy VII was to Square. their immensely popular instant classic that sent ripples throughout the industry. Its unparalleled success acted as the catalyst that caused the entire survival horror tectonic plate to shift into a new direction, and many other popular IPs followed suit, including Silent Hill, Alone in the Dark, and even Fatal Frame to a smaller extent. To make things more complicated, brand new action horror IPs emerged during this transition, adding further confusion, because some still implemented survival horror aspects of their own, including Dead Space and Fear, both of which began their tenure with notable critical acclaim themselves. The former even took direct inspiration from Resident Evil 4, according to director Glenn Schofield.
Some of my influences to make Dead Space from the game industry were definitely the Resident Evil series. And Resident Evil 4 had just come out. One of the things I would say to the team is we're going to make Resident Evil in space.
Survival horror attributes even bled out into cooperative multiplayer in the form of Resident Evil Outbreak, and later the more action-oriented first-person shooter Left 4 Dead, where a team of 4 players were tasked with reaching the end of a map and stockpiling ammo and healing items, and possibly setting up traps for pursuers along the way. Eventually, things came to a head for the identity crisis-stricken genre, and many of these series started to tread dangerous waters by leaning too far away from their horror roots. Resident Evil 6 launched in 2012 and, despite high sales, alienated a lot of longtime fans who begrudgingly accepted the IP's gradual shift up until that point. During that same year, Silent Hill effectively committed franchise suicide with the subpar downpour, painfully disappointing HD collection, and Book of Memories, which wasn't even a survival horror game, but a dungeon-crawling RPG, all within an 8-month span. In early 2013, Dead Space 3 practically threw away all of the design philosophies of the first 2 games, and its remaining horror aspects felt like a thin, superficial veil covering its obvious but futile clawing at mass appeal. Things weren't looking good for the genre. Not only was the line separating survival horror from action horror blurred to the point of being unrecognizable, a foreboding trend was also established that made it seem like every survival horror franchise was fated to ditch its humble horror beginnings in favor of set pieces and tight, focused combat, in an attempt to maximize broad market interest. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel. While mainstream developers and publishers were busy attempting to maximize sales, independent creators were picking up the slack with truly horror-focused experiences, including Penumbra, Amnesia, Cry of Fear, and Outlast. Eventually, this returning swing would reach higher-profile companies too, and we would see some big names bringing things back to basics. In 2014, a lot happened. In August, the gaming community as a whole was shaken to its core by the small, enigmatic PT. A mere demo meant to provide a taste of the upcoming Silent Hills, directed by the illustrious Hideo Kojima with the help of equally talented minds like filmmaker Guillermo del Toro and horror mangaka Junji Ito. In October, The Evil Within launched, and its director, Shinji Mikami, bluntly expressed his displeasure with the genre's shift towards action, stating, "For me personally, why I came back to survival horror is that survival horror as a genre is becoming all action now. There aren't any real survival horror games in the world right now. That is the biggest motivation for me." This is pretty amusing considering the fact that some people would blame him for this shift to begin with as the director of Resident Evil 4, but I digress. In that same month, Alien Isolation also released, bringing the survival horror concept back to its roots in a very satisfying manner. Based off the popular film franchise, the game features the player character on a spaceship with very limited resources and an unkillable antagonist that you must avoid rather than fight. Sound familiar? Finally, in 2017, this genre return to form was capped off with Resident Evil 7. The long-running and influential series leaped back to its origins, focusing more on horror, puzzles, strict resource management, and knowing when to fight and when to run away. In summation, the history of survival horror is a bit of a roller coaster, There was a slow, steady rise all the way up to 1996 where it exploded with Resident Evil and later Silent Hill and other noteworthy IPs. Then seemingly peaked at 2005 with Resident Evil 4, which then caused some wild turbulence by the beginning of the genre's identity crisis among its most popular franchises, before plummeting after it succumbs to its desire for mainstream success, and eventually rising again. The independent horror scene stayed quite consistent in comparison, though it went through its fair share of trends as well. The ups and downs were both plentiful, and a lot of things were learned as a result of the experimentation, but also at the cost of some formerly beloved names. Resident Evil is still going strong, yes, but what about others? Smaller IPs like Clock Tower and Dino Crisis have been dead and gone since before the transition to action even began. Haunting Ground stayed a one-off game that never spawned its own series. Silent Hill has been lying in dormancy since the departure of Hideo Kojima from Konami, which caused the cancellation of Silent Hills. Nothing remains of the series beyond the appearance of Pyramid Head and Heather in Dead by Daylight, and persistent rumors that something is in the works, but nothing's clear as to what, and that's assuming the rumors are even true. Siren was followed by 2 sequels and managed to stay pretty much unscathed by the action shift, but it too has been left untouched for over a decade, with Team Siren moving on to create the very successful action-adventure series Gravity Rush. Alone in the Dark fell off the face of the earth so quickly and quietly few people are even aware of the existence of the failed co-op game that came out in 2015. Dead Space is effectively a corpse, along with its father studio, Visceral Games, which has been thrown into the mass grave of other developers executed by EA. However, the first game's director, Glenn Schofield, recently announced the series' spiritual successor, the Callisto Protocol, at the Game Awards 2020, so there's at least a glimmer of hope there for Dead Space fans. For the most part, during this period, it's independent games helping to pick up the slack with more traditional horror projects. It's been pretty common for the last several years for budding developers to try to capture the feel of Golden Age horror games, including noteworthy titles like Detention, Phasmophobia, Soma, Layers of Fear, World of Horror, and more. There's also been a particularly large amount of activity dedicated to trying to recreate the atmosphere and experience created by the short but groundbreaking PT, which unfortunately won't be realized into a full Silent Hill game, so others have taken it upon themselves to try and do it, if not recreate PT itself in its entirety. In the wake of all this confusion and IP self-destruction, one thing still remains: the muddied definition of survival horror. To this day, people still use the term in reference to any horror game with limited resources, item management, and a fairly deliberate pace, regardless of how much action may be prevalent in its gameplay, or how progression is structured. Thus, the categories of survival horror and action horror are still tangled together, because the differences between the two aren't all that obvious anymore on a mechanical level. And I'm not the kind of person who would ever go out of my way to snobbishly correct someone else simply for using the term in passing. I'm not that pedantic. In fact, I catch myself using the two terms interchangeably from time to time as well. But if we were to take a step back and try to determine the most distinctive and important attributes of a survival horror game, what conclusion would we come to? Is there truly one crucial aspect of the subgenre that can help discern itself from others under the horror umbrella? I should disclaim once again that I do not consider myself to be any sort of end-all be-all authority on horror games. As I stated near the start of the video, I can say without a shadow of a doubt that there are plenty of other people, some of whom are content creators on YouTube already, who dedicate themselves to the genre with far more passion and investment than me. I'm just one guy making observations and giving his thoughts. The things you're going to hear from this point in the video onward are solely my own views on what survival horror is to me. It's a bit difficult to adequately distinguish the two clashing subgenres, survival and action horror, on a mechanical level, and many people make the discussion worse by throwing out a laundry list of essential traits for the former that look inconsistent with others' requirements at best, or rigid, dated, and over-exact at worst. If I'm being frank here, some of the characteristics tossed around by survival horror purists about what makes a game a true survival horror often reeks of pedantry. I understand the mindset that it's easier to establish a criteria based on what the pioneering game did, and often that game being referred to is Resident Evil. Thus, some people insist that necessities to be considered survival horror must include things like a static camera, tank controls, playing as a solo character, etc. The problem with this line of thinking is that Resident Evil took the vast majority of its ideas, mechanics, and systems from Sweet Home, which is an 8-bit turn-based RPG where you could control a team of up to 3 characters. So arbitrary requirements like a static camera and tank controls don't really fly when you zoom out beyond the first few installments of the Resident Evil franchise. Even Silent Hill 1, which came out in the same generation, doesn't have a static camera for a significant portion of its story, and I don't think anyone in their right mind would disqualify it from being survival horror. So I personally feel that if we're going to clean up and re-establish the boundary between survival and action horror, we need to toss out arbitrary criteria like that. Furthermore, one of the biggest misunderstandings about the conversation of what separates survival horror from action horror is the idea that the descriptor of action horror is some kind of criticism or pejorative instead of its own legitimate subgenre. And I'd like to set that record straight by saying, nothing is wrong with action horror. It has just as much of a place under the horror umbrella as survival horror does. Many of the best horror games in general are action horror, and I mentioned a lot of them in this very video. I love Resident Evil 4, I love Dead Space, I love Left 4 Dead, Fear, etc. I have a blast with them. Action horror is fucking awesome, and not just in games, but in film too. Being called action horror is not an insult and shouldn't be used as one, because a new IP coming along and making the decision to simply focus on more responsive, finely tuned combat than just spooks and helplessness is not an inherently bad move. I don't want anyone to walk away from this video thinking that I don't like action horror, because that couldn't be any further from the truth. Alright, now that the history lesson and the long-winded preface are all out of the way, let's finally discuss my personal answer to the question, what is survival horror? To me, the key element of survival horror is exactly what's written on the tin: survival. It seems obvious, partially because the nature of all horror games is to technically survive, right? That is true, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. Thematically, survival and action horror achieve the goal differently. The former tends to focus on vulnerability, isolation, puzzle solving, and running away from enemies just as much as, if not more than, directly engaging them. In fact, sometimes engaging is simply not even an option. The latter seeks to empower the player by giving them weapons and plentiful ammunition, and encouraging them to blast through their targets and show them who's boss. One is more investigative and promotes the avoidance and participation of combat either in equal measure or with a stronger lean towards avoidance. And the other is more confrontational, and combat is more or less the crux of the whole experience. And this is pretty widely understood. But the question this video is meant to discuss is, how is the essence of survival captured in gameplay? Not through writing or general themes, and not through atmosphere, but through direct interactivity. What are the key mechanics that separate the two subgenres the most, especially when a game can have engaging combat and still be considered true survival horror? This is where the discussion gets a bit complicated and leads to some people crafting those lists of inflexible, arbitrary requirements. But the answer is fairly simple on the surface: choice. Survival means choice. Decisions must be made to ensure you stay alive and make progress. One of the most obvious ways that choice manifests itself in both survival and action horror is resource management, as many games already incorporate. Weapons, ammunition, healing items, keys, they all take up precious space, and usually you're expected to stay organized and avoid being wasteful so you're never up shit's creek without a paddle. But that's just one cog in the machine, and not even the biggest one. True survival comes from a combination of 3 other things working in tandem: level design, enemy placement, and rewards. This is a trifecta that determines whether a game is true survival horror or not. And how do these things contribute to the feeling of choice? Well, let's think about it. Level design is fairly clear. Linear maps made up of mostly corridors and rooms with only 2 exits don't really support the idea of exploration as much as one large open building with many intersecting rooms, halls, or floors. If you remember, one of the most defining attributes taken from Sweet Home over to Resident Evil was the massive mansion with a Metroidvania-style structure that allowed you to go back and forth between any areas you desired. And there are often locked doors or paths that you would discover early but couldn't access until a key or switch is discovered later, which would require backtracking. It's often that survival horror games include this kind of level design because it encourages, practically enforces, exploration to some extent. But either by luck, knowledge, or previous experience, it's possible to streamline your wandering so that you only go where you need to be and acquire the correct items and solve the right puzzles to make a beeline to progress. Thus, it's common for a good portion of a game's map to be optionally accessible. With this type of structure, choice is embedded directly into the world. If you're new to the game or simply trying a different approach, you can ultimately go where you wish in any order you wish within the limitations of hard progress. The most famous examples of this I can probably use are the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1 or the RPD station in Resident Evil 2, especially since the latter is fresher in people's minds thanks to the remake. These areas are somewhat open from the get-go, with several accessible rooms that are momentarily unimportant or just dead ends. But there is a set procedure that needs to be fulfilled in order to continue with the game and unlock more areas. In Resident Evil 2, regardless of how you play, you still need to fulfill certain requirements to gain access to more of the RPD station, expanding the accessible portions of the map as you solve puzzles and collect keys. Eventually, the whole building is open to you, including the basement areas, and you're free to go where you please until you decide to progress the story and head into the sewer past Kendo's shop. Matter of fact, even if you do head to the sewer, you can still unlock a shortcut back to RPD, meaning that about 2/3 of the entire game is one massive area you can freely wander around in. You're not locked out of going back until you take the cable car down to Nest. Sometimes, in the RPD, rooms and corridors you've previously visited will have different enemies in them, and eventually you'll be chased by Mr. X, adding a greater sense of tension and suspense to your exploration. This leads us to the second of our trifecta, enemy placement. Enemy placement is important because it further pressures the player to discern when it's the right moment to spend those limited, precious resources they've been saving up. Every encounter with an enemy, no matter how threatening they may actually be, should invoke within the player a decision between 2 things: using ammo to defeat the enemy, or run past them and risk the use of healing items if grabbed or attacked. And it's easy to assume that consuming ammunition might be the better choice every single time, but is it really? The reason this choice exists in more traditional survival horror is because if the game has the open, intersecting map design I mentioned, then not every room is going to be worth clearing out. Some rooms and hallways are only worth entering once or twice and then probably never again, or at least not until much later, especially if you're already familiar with the game and know how to navigate the map in a way that minimizes enemy encounters. And if you find yourself with a limited amount of ammo already, you may be better off bobbing and weaving through zombies and monsters to simply do what you need to do and then get out. Meanwhile, important hallways and hub rooms with multiple connecting paths will be visited several, maybe even dozens of times. And some survival horror games know this and will try to surprise the player by spawning new enemies in these rooms after a period of time, a certain amount of progress, or a specific number of re-entries. Essentially, ammunition and healing items are practically currency that you run the risk of spending in order to complete an encounter. And on a case-by-case basis, you must decide which is more valuable and should be saved for later, and which can be used right now. Ideally, it's neither, but you should always be ready and willing to choose one. Now you may be thinking, but how do we get more of those things if we need them? Don't we have to kill enemies to replenish those resources? That's a fair question, and it leads me to the third part of our survival horror trifecta, rewards. And believe it or not, this is arguably the most important of the 3, as it more or less acts as the linchpin keeping all parts together. Rewards for exploration and rewards for defeating enemies are ultimately the driving force behind what a player is obligated to do in order to progress or discover more items. And it's where action horror and survival horror fully diverge and highlight their own differing priorities. In a more traditional survival horror game, weapons, ammunition, upgrades, healing items, and more are almost exclusively found through exploration, and this is to take advantage of the large interconnected map. This system de-emphasizes combat and underlines exploration as the more crucial part of the experience. Going back and forth between rooms, searching high and low for a key that unlocks a door that may lead to progress or a nice item, and interacting with every piece of the environment that looks interactable isn't just for the sake of doing so. It's because that's how resources are found. You carefully turn over every stone and the game rewards you with more of those precious resources you need to complete your mission. But that's if you choose to do so, because exploration and seeking items beyond what's needed for progress is optional. The only reasons you would go out of your way to clear the entire map, aside from enjoyment, is for the sake of completion or because you truly need every single bullet and healing item at your disposal. On the flip side, action horror game maps typically don't have those wide, open, intersecting layouts. They're more linear with possibly a few short, divergent branches. In fact, some games don't even have an in-game map for you to look at because it would be pointless. Dead Space had one for the rare occasion that splitting paths would lead you to the same point, but it was removed for Dead Space 2 because, frankly, the objective tracker did its job well enough that a map just seemed redundant. Even without one, it's damn near impossible to get lost in that game. Item pickups still exist, of course, but discovering items with a keen eye is no longer the primary way to acquire them. In an action horror game's linearity, combat is more emphasized, and therefore rewards are shifted towards engagement with the enemy. Thus, killing them is what leads to them dropping ammo and healing items. This means the choice between fighting or running no longer exists in the same way that it does with survival horror. With a straightforward map that leads directly from point A to point B, and enemies being the primary source of items, the game wants and expects you to fight every foe you come across. You can still run past them, but the choice doesn't carry the same amount of weight behind it. Whereas exploration equals items in survival horror, enemies equal items in action horror, and by avoiding combat you avoid resources as rewards. So unless you're trying to speedrun, avoiding everything isn't really the best way to play. In fact, there's an argument to be made that it's the opposite of how the game wants you to play. So what's the reward for killing enemies in survival horror if not for items, you may ask? Well, remember when I said you should clear out rooms that you'll likely return to many times? That is the reward. Disposing of enemies in important rooms you'll be revisiting is vital to a smooth playthrough, because you don't want to enter a room 24 times and have to zigzag around zombies you leave alive, because it's a risk each time you do it. Conversely, it's just as much a reward to conserve ammo by knowing when you don't need to dispose of enemies. And since ammunition is limited to what's available out in the world, as opposed to potentially plentiful as enemy drops, or in some cases theoretically unlimited as shop purchases, the choice of which enemies to kill in which rooms is an important, constant one to make, especially in higher difficulties where enemies are more durable but the amount of discoverable ammunition is still the same or perhaps even lowered. All of this is how the feeling of survival manifests through gameplay in survival horror, by forcing the player to make important judgment calls on a moment-to-moment basis. Which room do I enter first? Should I spend my ammo on these zombies or try to run past them? Do I think I'll be coming back to this room multiple times in the future? Should I explore more and look for items at the risk of running into enemies, or should I risk progressing with what little I have? So on and so forth, all while making their way to the end of the game. A lot of these choices aren't as prevalent in action horror because the decision is more or less made for you. The experience is more on rails. The map is linear and the game will lead you to all the rooms anyway. You're expected to kill these enemies because their drops are the most consistent way to get ammo and items, assuming there isn't also an in-game store. You explore almost automatically because there's not many branching paths to begin with, and it's rare to return to a place you already visited unless the story directs you back there. And again, this isn't me criticizing the action horror formula. I love action horror, and there's a place for it within the horror sphere with people who want a creepy atmosphere, strong sound design, and that feeling of isolation, but without necessarily being helpless or needing to scour a huge map for items. A lot of people enjoy good combat, and a horror game choosing to focus on delivering that is not an intrinsically bad decision. If anything, the shift to action that the survival horror subgenre experienced in the mid to late 2000s was probably inevitable. Sooner or later, a survival horror developer was gonna suggest, how about we try to make combat fun and engaging instead of something to avoid? That thought is really all that's needed to get the ball rolling in that direction. In fact, Shinji Mikami entertaining a very similar thought is why Resident Evil 4 became what it is during development. In an interview with Game Informer back in 2004, Mikami recalled playing Resident Evil 0 and how he was dissatisfied with it. I remember playing Resident Evil 0 and saying to myself that this is just more of the same. This is why I wanted to change the system. With the new system, I could once again feel nervous and scared when I play it. To add on to this, in interviews with IGN and GameSpy, the game's producer, Hiroyuki Kobayashi, shared his agreement. The staff, which includes myself and of course Shinji Mikami, decided that we wanted to go in a new direction and recreate the series. We were tired of making the same stuff as well. We wanted to make something new and original. The reason why we went through all these ideas is because the whole concept of RE4 was to reinvent the game. We wanted to give the gamers something new. In the past installments, we were stuck in the cookie-cutter RE mold. We had to break those shackles holding us down before we came up with something new. All that it takes for a series or even an entire genre to begin a massive paradigm shift is the persistence of one or two creative leaders that seek to change things. Their resounding success sent ripples across the industry, and many others sought to grasp that same level of acclaim. It's a process that has repeated itself many times over within the industry with other genres and trends. One game is incredibly successful at doing something different or engaging, and suddenly everyone and their mother tries to recreate it for themselves. And the widespread changes caused by these trends aren't always great. But the experimentation can lead to interesting new ideas and IPs while filtering out the bad ones. That's just how these things go. Niche genres stumbling upon newfound popularity and success often means they stumble upon newfound growing pains as well. It's not always pretty, but it's how boundaries are discovered, blurred, or outright demolished. I hope that one day we'll once again see a second survival horror golden age that's as strong as the first was back in the mid-90s to mid-2000s. Independent game creators are still keeping the momentum up as they always have been, developing titles that span a wide spectrum of horror. But it would also be a delight if we were to see some huge comebacks from old classics like Dino Crisis, Silent Hill, Siren, and others. With technology where it's at now, and all the experience and knowledge the genre and its creators have gained, it could be amazing. Maybe one day. In the near future, however, we have Resident Evil 8, or Village, to look forward to. It seems to take many cues from Resident Evil 4, including setting, progression, inventory management, and characters, but also apparently seeks to merge those traits with the atmosphere and pace of Resident Evil 7. At least that's the impression I got from the Maiden demo, which is admittedly supposed to be a mere visual showcase, but it was eerie and spooky nonetheless. And who knows, maybe the combination of these attributes from both games could create the sweet spot Resident Evil could thrive the most in for many games to come. And then beyond that, there's persistent rumors surrounding the remake of Resident Evil 4, which hasn't even been announced yet but seems like an inevitability. Could Capcom catch lightning in a bottle twice with the same game? We'll have to wait and see. This concludes my video on survival horror, its history and its most distinctive characteristics. Hopefully I explained myself clearly and adequately enough and I didn't come off as some sort of hardcore genre purist myself, because I swear I'm not. But if you made it this far into the video, then I hope you liked what you saw. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
So we finally meet.